so Zoe Heller, tell me you're here. There you are, great. All right, she was appointed Assistant Director for Policy Development at CalRecycle. Before CalRecycle, she was at the EPA Southwest Office for 10 years, where she managed the zero waste section from 2014 to 2017, Special Assistant to the Regional Administrator, that sounds super important, from the 2012 to 2013. She's here to discuss how the export of recyclable material is a key component of California's recycling infrastructure. Come on up, Zoe. Your timer is right here. What's that? Your timer is right here.
Okay, that's good to know. Good afternoon, everybody. So how many of you are familiar with China's recent policies to restrict imports of, okay, so almost everybody. Great. So I won't give any background, but I'll just give a little bit of background just in case there are I saw a couple hands like this. So back in 2013, China introduced Green Fence, which was a policy that aimed to reduce contamination of the imports of recyclable materials. We saw some impacts in California at that time from that policy, some backups at the ports, increased inspections, but overall that policy did not meet China's goals to clean up their environment. So this past July of 2017, we started hearing rumblings of this new policy called National Sword. National Sword came into effect in March, and what it's doing is there's an actual ban of certain materials that are allowed to be imported into China. These include mixed paper and mixed plastics, and several others that aren't commonly found in our blue bin. In addition, that policy also changed the acceptable level of contamination in our bales to 0.5%, which is really tough for a lot of our MRFs here to meet. So that's the overall policy. The next speaker, Kate, will talk more about the impetus behind it and what's happening more globally in the exports market. And I'm going to focus more on the overall impact here in California. Thank you. I've never used one of these before, kind of, okay. Okay, but first let's take a giant step back because I think the discussion of what recycling means here in California is really important for framing this discussion. So what does recycling mean? And the answer is it really depends on where you sit. So through the eyes of the public, it's generally tossing something in your blue bin. From the eyes of the solid waste industry and local governments, it's actually the nuts and bolts, the practicalities, the collection programs, the infrastructure of recycling. And then through the eyes of the law is the driving force. And in California, we have multiple statutes that address recycling. And there's two commonalities in these statutes, at least in most of them, that are relevant to China's policies that I want to just highlight for you all. So the first is, and David Alloway alluded to this earlier, what we count as recycling is basically anything that isn't going to disposal. In some cases, collection counts, but it's just what we're diverting from landfill or disposal. And another piece of this statute is that we count what we export as recycling without necessarily knowing if these materials that we're exporting are getting recycled, and also what percentage of those materials are getting recycled. So keep that in mind as I go through the presentation. The public perception of recycling is really interesting. You know, I asked friends and family over the last couple of months, as I've been thinking about National Sword and implications, what recycling means to them. And most people feel really great about taking their bottles, taking their cans, taking their newspapers and throwing them in a blue bin. But when asking beyond, well, what happens beyond that? Generally the answer is, well, it's turned into a new material. So what's missing from the public conversation is all the things that happen in between. So does this matter? Yes, it does matter. And it matters for a number of reasons, but the one that I want to highlight today is if the public isn't informed about the whole recycling process, then it's really hard for them to participate, particularly at the local level, in these important conversations about how to make it better. And also there's a lack of understanding of the shared responsibility within the recycling process. So this pie chart shows generation of materials in California in 2016. And if you look at the green and the blue slices, that's what was recycled, 44% of materials. Approximately 1/3 of that was exported. And to look at that from a slightly different frame, about 2/3, and this is a rough estimate, but we think it's somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the materials that we threw in our blue bin in 2016 were exported. So that's a lot. So what comes up is, then what does recycling mean in practice? So in California, we've built really strong programmatic and physical infrastructure to make progress towards our goals in statute. And these programs have brought California to a pretty good place. You know, we're a leader in our industry. But for the most part, what this infrastructure looks like is a really strong collect, sort, and export infrastructure. With some domestic remanufacturing, we've heard about some of that today, but we're very reliable on exports. Oh boy, time goes by fast. So what this means is these policies that China's put forward have an impact on our recycling system overall, and brings us back to that question of what does recycling mean in California? Okay, a little bit more on exports because this is pretty interesting. So in 2016, we exported 15 million tons of materials. 62% of that went to China. And the vessel value of those exports was $4.6 billion. So that's a lot of material. But what you can see from this graph is that exports have been declining since 2011. 2011 recession, 2013 green fence, 2017 national sword. The blue bar here is China, the yellow bar is the rest of the countries that we export to. So going back to what recycling in California means, does our definition of recycling matter? Once again, yes. It matters because it's resulted in an over-reliance on exports. So given our dependence on China as a primary consumer of our materials, China's import policies are of critical importance. Another point to add is that other countries are absorbing some of what we were sending to China. Taiwan and Vietnam have upped their capacity and their ability to take materials. But it isn't enough, and we're still left with a lot of materials domestically. So you're not going to be able to read this slide, but what it represents, each green and blue bubble is a piece of China's policy that has impacted our exports overall. This can be found on our website, and it's a timeline since 2013 of essentially everything that's happened with China's policy and how we've been impacted by it. So check it out. So getting to the impact on the United States and California. So we're already seeing quite a bit happening here. The first thing, which I mentioned earlier, is there aren't markets for our materials. So what does that look like? At solid waste facilities, it looks like materials are stockpiling. This is mostly mixed paper and some low-grade plastics. And then if they stockpile for too long or the material or the facilities don't have permits to hold those materials, they're gonna go to landfill. So we're already seeing that here in the United States and in California. In addition, jurisdictions are working with their haulers and solid waste facilities to make changes to accommodate these policies and to reduce contamination levels to the best of their ability. One thing to keep in mind here is those changes are expensive, and they have to happen in order for us to find markets for materials. Quickly on the national response, this hit the recycling industry hard. And there was a lot of vague information coming out in 2017 about what these policies really meant. So the major waste and recycling associations here in the United States wrote comment letters to the World Trade Organization with their concerns, mainly asking for more specifications in the guidelines, asking for a longer time to be able to implement these new standards, particularly the 0.5% contamination standard, and also just giving a high-level overview of how these policies are going to impact the global recycling market. In addition, Senators Feinstein and Wyden wrote a letter to the China's ambassador echoing these comments. But the standards came out in January 1st unchanged, and the policy went into effect March 1st. Okay, I've got a minute, so I'm going to run through this quickly. State response. CalRecycle put together a website. It's a clearinghouse of information on the ban. We also presented at our public meeting and had a lot of public comment about how different stakeholders are being impacted. We've sent letters to our local enforcement agencies and our jurisdictions, the local enforcement agencies, to remind them of the guidance that exists for flexibility and permit requirements for facilities that might need to store materials for longer. jurisdictions mainly sharing information about innovative practices different jurisdictions are taking on in response. I was going to talk a little bit about packaging reform in 1383. You heard about 1383 from Ken. Part of that is we're requiring organics collection. Paper is part of our definition of organics for 1383, so we're hopeful that that will reduce contamination in the paper stream in California. Packaging reform, we're developing a recommendation to reduce packaging waste here in California, and that should come out within the next couple of months, so keep your eyes peeled on our website for that. Local response, encouraging waste prevention. You've seen some bans of polystyrene throughout the state, plastic bags, et cetera. So waste prevention is high up on the list. In addition, looking at ways to reduce contamination through the collection process and improving processing at the MRF, hiring more sorters, breaking apart bales to look at contamination. We've got some funding opportunities at CalRecycle that can help address this problem, mainly the materials that are included in the ban. And then in conclusion, I just want to bring you all back to the beginning of our presentation. China's policies are changing our definition of recycling in California, and we're all going to have to work together to address this change in definition and change our paradigm from collect, sort, export, and get more remanufacturing here. Okay, thank you.
Is this about the glass?
Okay. Oh, sorry. There we go. Yes. So just a quick question about if you know how much material at this point is being landfilled because of the stockpiling issue, and if you're hearing any jurisdictions planning on changing any of their programs affiliated with these inability to move materials.
Good questions. We don't have numbers on what's being landfilled. We do know numbers on what's no longer being exported. So for example, from 15 to 16, we saw a 1 million ton drop in mixed paper being exported. For your second question, we did, through our local assistance program, pool our jurisdictions to find out if local collection programs are changing as far as what they're accepting in their blue bins. And right now, generally the answer is no. And the reason is because markets are so variable that sometimes 1 week they can find markets for 3 through 7 plastics, and the next week they can't, but they might be able to find some markets for mixed paper. So it's so variable, and they really want to be able to sell whatever they can to recoup the losses that are happening with the drop in commodity prices. So not yet, but that could come.
In 2012, I saw this video. It's called Death by China, and it basically talks about the imports and exports that we are doing here in the U.S. And I think that we're looking at it as a negative thing, but I think because we are so reliant on exporting our materials out, that it's aided the dwindling economy of the recycling industry that we have locally as far as facilities and market value. So is there any incentives to increase local recycling chains back up?
Yeah. Really great points there, and you're right on point. So yes, because of our reliance on export markets, we lost a lot of our infrastructure here, and that's a huge problem for us now. So there's some tax incentive programs, there's some grants and loans that we have in California, but that's not going to move the needle. So hopefully more to come on that front so that we have market opportunities, whatever it might be, to build up that infrastructure. And the other good point that you made that I just want to address is that I didn't mean to frame China in a negative light. What they're doing is to protect their environment, which, as you've all seen through various documentaries like Plastic China, has been really challenging for a long time. So this shift to become a more green economy is a good thing, and it kind of points the finger at the rest of the world for we can no longer ship our trash to other places. We have to be responsible for it.